November 7, 1943. A formation of Messerschmitt Bf 109 Gustavs climbed through the cold morning air over Bremen, Germany. Second Lieutenant Hans Wieck, flying his 109 G-6, felt the familiar vibration as his two 13mm MG-131 machine guns came online. The characteristic bulges on his engine cowling, the Buell as the pilots called them, housed the breeches of these weapons. Above him, 376 American B-17 Flying Fortresses droned toward Schweinfurt, each bristling with up to 13 Browning .50 caliber machine guns. Wieck's 109 carried 500 rounds total for his cowl-mounted MG-131s. The bombers above him? Each waist gunner alone had access to over 500 rounds per gun, and they had multiple guns. As Wieck closed to attack altitude, he knew what every Luftwaffe pilot knew by late 1943. The Americans had something Germany didn't. Not better pilots, not better tactics, but an industrial philosophy that had produced a heavy machine gun so reliable, so versatile, and so overwhelmingly present that it had changed the mathematics of aerial combat. This is the story of two machine guns that shaped the air war over Europe. One was the M2 Browning, a weapon so successful it remains in service 80 years after its creation. The other was the MG-131, a German response that was technically brilliant but strategically insufficient. And the question that haunts military historians isn't whether Germany copied America's design. They didn't. It's why Germany, with some of the most advanced engineering in the world, never fully committed to the heavy machine gun doctrine that would dominate warfare for the rest of the century. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Browning M250 caliber machine gun didn't begin as an aircraft weapon. It began as a problem. In April 1918, General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force in France, sent an urgent cable to the War Department in Washington. German Junkers J.I aircraft had appeared over the Western Front, heavily armored against conventional rifle-caliber machine guns. Pershing needed a weapon that could penetrate that armor. He needed a machine gun firing a cartridge at least half an inch in diameter, with a muzzle velocity of at least 2,700 feet per second. The man who answered that call was John Moses Browning, arguably the greatest firearms designer in history. By 1918, Browning had already revolutionized American small arms with the M1911 pistol, the M1917 machine gun, and the Browning automatic rifle. Now, at 63 years old, he began redesigning his 30-06 M1917 machine gun to fire a much larger cartridge. Winchester developed the ammunition, a scaled-up version of the 30-06 round. Initially, they added a rim to the cartridge for use in an anti-tank rifle, but Pershing insisted it be rimless for use in machine guns. The first prototype underwent trials on October 15, 1918. It fired at less than 500 rounds per minute. The muzzle velocity was only 2,300 feet per second. The gun was heavy, difficult to control, and underpowered for the anti-armor role. Then the war ended. Development might have stopped there, but the U.S. Army had captured German 13.2mm Mauser anti-tank rifles and their ammunition during the fighting. Those German rounds achieved 2,700 feet per second with an 800-grain bullet and could penetrate 1 inch of armor at 250 yards. Winchester engineers studied those captured rounds and improved the American .50 caliber cartridge to match that performance. By 1921, Browning and engineer Fred T. Moore had produced the M1921 Browning machine gun. It was water-cooled, belt-fed, and fired the new 50 BMG cartridge at 500 to 600 rounds per minute. The water jacket and cooling system made the weapon weigh 121 pounds when full, dropping to 79 pounds when empty. It was massively heavy, but it worked. The gun underwent continuous refinement throughout the 1920s. In the 1930s, engineers developed an air-cooled version designated the M2. Without water cooling, the lighter barrel couldn't sustain more than 75 rounds before overheating to the point of fracture. The solution was the M2HB heavy barrel. A thicker, stronger barrel compensated for the loss of water cooling while still reducing the weapon's weight to 84 pounds. That heavy barrel version became the standard. For aircraft use, engineers created the M2, The N stood for Army/Navy, since both services jointly developed it. The aircraft version had a lighter 36-inch barrel and weighed just 61 pounds complete. Cooled by the aircraft's slipstream, the M2 could sustain rates of fire between 600 and 800 rounds per minute. It could be fired from an electrically operated remote-mount solenoid trigger when installed as a fixed gun. By the time war erupted in Europe in September 1939, the Browning M2 had become the standard heavy machine gun across all branches of the American military. Navy ships carried them for anti-aircraft defense. Army units mounted them on vehicles and tripods, and the Army Air Corps installed them by the thousands in bombers and fighters. The 50 BMG cartridge itself was a marvel. At 5.45 inches long with a .51-inch diameter bullet weighing 707 grains, it delivered devastating kinetic energy. Armor-piercing rounds achieved muzzle velocities of 2,840 feet per second. Some specialized rounds reached 3,450 feet per second. The cartridge could penetrate armor, destroy engines, ignite fuel tanks, and at range, still deliver lethal force against personnel. But the genius of the M2 wasn't just its power. It was its versatility and reliability. The same basic gun served on the ground, at sea, and in the air. It used disintegrating metallic link belts that could be connected for sustained fire. The belt feed system was robust, simple, and rarely jammed. The short recoil operation was mechanical, requiring no electrical system beyond an optional solenoid trigger for fixed installations. A trained crew could change the barrel quickly, though even that became easier in later variants with the quick-change barrel system. Most critically, the M2 could be manufactured in enormous quantities. By 1942, when America entered the war, multiple factories were producing Browning 50s at industrial scale. Colt had been manufacturing them since 1933. Other contractors joined production as demand exploded. The weapon wasn't just good. It was available. Every B-17 Flying Fortress that rolled out of Boeing's Seattle plant carried at least 11 Browning 50s. Some variants carried 13. Each B-24 Liberator had 10. The P-47 Thunderbolt carried 8. The P-51 Mustang carried 6. Even the Navy's fighters and torpedo bombers mounted Browning 50s. By 1944, American factories were producing over 400,000 aircraft-mounted Brownings per year, alongside tens of thousands of ground and vehicle-mounted versions. This wasn't just armament. It was industrial warfare at a scale Germany could not match. When Hans Wieck climbed toward those American bombers on that November morning in 1943, he was facing the accumulated firepower of an industrial system that had fully committed to the heavy machine gun as the foundation of its aerial armament doctrine. Germany had taken a different path, and understanding why requires going back to the early 1930s, when the German military began developing its own vision of modern aerial warfare. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, had forbidden Germany from possessing an air force. But restrictions can be circumvented, and throughout the 1920s, German engineers and pilots trained secretly in the Soviet Union while German aircraft companies developed supposedly civilian designs that could be rapidly converted to military use. When Adolf Hitler came to power in January 1933, one of his first priorities was rebuilding German military aviation. The Luftwaffe was officially established on March 1, 1935, openly defying Versailles. The new Air Force needed modern fighters, and those fighters needed armament. German engineers at Rheinmetall-Borsig studied the problem. They looked at what other nations were doing. They examined the American Browning, which by the mid-30s was becoming the standard NATO heavy machine gun. They studied the Soviet 12.7mm DSHK. They analyzed the requirements for synchronized fire through a propeller disc, for flexible defensive installations in bombers, and for ground attack. What they created was the MG-131, and it was, in many ways, a technical masterpiece. Development began in 1938. The specification called for a weapon that could fire a heavy 13mm cartridge at high rates of fire while being significantly lighter and more compact than existing heavy machine guns. The goal was to create a weapon that could fit into the same mountings as the standard 7.92mm MG-17 rifle caliber guns, allowing German fighters to upgrade to heavier armament without major airframe modifications. The MG-131 that emerged from this development was remarkable. It weighed just 16.6 kilograms, 37 pounds. That was less than 60% of the M2 Browning's weight and dramatically lighter than the Italian Breda 12.7, which weighed 50 pounds. Despite this lightweight, the MG-131 achieved a cyclic rate of 900 rounds per minute in its standard aircraft configuration. It was a recoil-operated, air-cooled weapon that could fire armor-piercing incendiary, high-explosive incendiary, and tracer ammunition. The 13x64B cartridge it fired was shorter than the 50 BMG but still delivered substantial hitting power. A 13mm armor-piercing round achieved 710 meters per second muzzle velocity with a projectile mass of 38.5 grams, producing 9,700 joules of muzzle energy. The high-explosive incendiary round carried 1.4 grams of PTN explosive plus 0.3 grams of thermite, enough to cause significant damage to aircraft structures and fuel systems. But the MG-131's most innovative feature was its electric priming system. Unlike conventional machine guns that used a mechanical firing pin to strike a primer, the MG-131 used electrically primed ammunition. An electrical current flowed directly to the cartridge primer, which heated instantly and ignited the propellant. This eliminated the mechanical delay inherent in solenoid-activated firing pin systems. For synchronized fire through a propeller disc, this was crucial. The synchronization system simply sent an electrical pulse at the precise moment the propeller blade cleared the gun's muzzle. The instant ignition of electrically primed ammunition allowed tighter synchronization tolerances and higher rates of fire compared to mechanically primed guns. The result was a weapon that could be installed in pairs on the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf FW 190, mounted in the restricted space of the engine cowling where the lighter MG-17 had originally been fitted. When the Bf 109 G6 entered production in early 1943, it carried two MG-131s above the engine plus a 20 or 30 mm cannon firing through the propeller hub. Those two MG-131s gave the Gustav a significant firepower advantage over earlier models armed with rifle-caliber guns. Luftwaffe pilots appreciated the upgrade. The MG-131's high-explosive rounds could damage American bombers in ways that 7.92 mm bullets could not. A burst from an MG-131 could shatter plexiglass, damage control surfaces, or ignite fuel leaks. Against the increasingly armored B-17s and B-24s that appeared over Germany in 1943, the heavier 13mm rounds offered better penetration than rifle-caliber guns. But there was a problem, and it wasn't the MG-131 itself. The problem was what Germany didn't build. While the MG-131 served admirably as an aircraft weapon, Germany never developed a comprehensive heavy machine gun doctrine for ground forces. And this wasn't because German engineers couldn't design such weapons. It was because the German military had made a fundamentally different strategic choice about how to organize its infantry firepower. To understand this choice, you have to understand German infantry doctrine as it evolved between the wars. The German army that entered World War I had relied on heavy, crew-served machine guns like the MG-08 Maxim. These weapons required multiple men to move and operate, weighed over 60 pounds without their mounts, and were fundamentally defensive weapons. But German tactical thinking evolved dramatically during the Great War. By 1918, stormtroop tactics emphasized mobile, aggressive infantry attacks supported by lighter, more portable automatic weapons. After Versailles, German military theorists continued refining this mobile warfare doctrine. When rearmament began in the early 30s, German designers created the MG-34, Maskengewehr 34, the first true general-purpose machine gun. The MG-34, firing the standard 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser rifle cartridge, was revolutionary. It weighed 26.7 pounds with its bipod. It could sustain fire at 800 to 900 rounds per minute. Most importantly, it was designed to fill multiple roles with a single weapon. With a bipod, one soldier could carry and fire it as a squad automatic weapon. Mounted on a Lafette 42 tripod, it became a sustained fire position weapon. Could even serve as an anti-aircraft gun. The MG-34 embodied the concept of Einheitsmaschinengewehr, the universal machine gun. One weapon, one caliber, one logistics chain, multiple roles. When the even more refined MG42 appeared in 1942, firing at 1,200 rounds per minute and easier to manufacture, the concept was perfected. German infantry squads were built around the machine gun. A 10-man group consisted of the squad leader, deputy squad leader, a 3-man machine gun team, and 5 riflemen. The riflemen existed primarily to protect and support the machine gunner. German tactical doctrine emphasized that the machine gun was the primary weapon of the squad, with rifles serving a secondary role. This was fundamentally different from American, British, or Soviet doctrine, where squads were built around riflemen with a light machine gun providing supporting fire. The German approach maximized the firepower achievable with a 7.92 mm cartridge through volume of fire and tactical positioning. The MG42's 1,200 round per minute cyclic rate, twice as fast as the Browning M1919 or British Vickers, created a psychological effect that Allied soldiers described as a tearing canvas sound. American troops called it Hitler's buzzsaw. The sound alone could suppress enemy movement. But this doctrine had a critical weakness. By optimizing around a rifle-caliber machine gun as the squad's primary weapon, Germany had no doctrinal need for a heavier, less portable machine gun at the infantry level. The 50-caliber Browning M2, mounted on its M3 tripod, weighed a total of 128 pounds, nearly 3 times the weight of an MG42 with its tripod. It required a crew of 2 or 3 men just to move any significant distance. It was fundamentally a position weapon or a vehicle-mounted weapon. The Americans used the 50 caliber for long-range suppression, anti-vehicle work, and anti-aircraft defense at company or battalion level. German forces used the 20 mm Flak 38 for anti-aircraft work, the Pak anti-tank guns for armor threats, and relied on their rifle-caliber machine guns for infantry suppression. Why carry a 50 caliber machine gun weighing over 100 pounds when an MG42 weighing 25 pounds could deliver devastating suppressive fire, and dedicated anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons handled threats beyond the MG42's capability? This made perfect sense until American industrial production changed the equation. The United States didn't just use the M2 as a crew-served weapon at battalion level. They mounted it on everything. Half-tracks carried them. Jeeps carried them. Trucks carried them. Tank commanders had them on turret mounts. American mechanization wasn't just about having vehicles. It was about using those vehicles to bring heavy weapons forward with the infantry, weapons that would have been impossible to carry on foot. By late 1943, an American mechanized infantry company advancing in Europe might have a dozen vehicle-mounted 50 caliber Brownings supporting its attack, plus 30 caliber Brownings on every vehicle, plus the squad automatic weapons the infantry carried. German infantry facing such a force had MG42s, brilliant weapons, but firing a rifle-caliber cartridge against an enemy with dramatically more vehicles and heavier weapons on those vehicles. In the air, the disparity was even more stark. When Hans Wieck pressed his attack against those B-17s over Bremen, his 2 MG-131s carried 250 rounds each, 500 rounds total. A single B-17 Flying Fortress carried 11 to 13 50 caliber Brownings, depending on the variant, with each gun having between 300 and 500 rounds. One bomber had more heavy machine gun ammunition than Wieck's entire staffel of 12 fighters combined. And there were 376 bombers in that formation. German fighter tactics evolved to compensate. Luftwaffe pilots learned to attack from head-on, where the bomber had the least defensive firepower. They used 20 and 30 mm cannons for standoff attacks. They developed specialized bomber-destroyer aircraft like the FW-198 Sturmbach, heavily armored and carrying 430 mm Mk-108 cannons. But these adaptations were responses to a fundamental imbalance. The Americans had fully committed their industrial base to producing heavy machine guns at a scale Germany never attempted. And this imbalance extended beyond just the guns themselves. It was about ammunition production. Every 50 caliber round required brass, copper, lead, propellant, and primers. Producing millions of rounds per month required vast industrial capacity. Germany, fighting on multiple fronts, facing strategic bombing, and struggling with resource shortages by 1943, could not match American ammunition production. Even if Germany had fielded heavy machine guns more widely, feeding them would have strained an already overtaxed logistics system. The MG-131 represented German engineering excellence. Lightweight, compact, innovative. But it was a weapon designed for aircraft, not a foundation for a heavy weapons doctrine that spanned all services. And by the time its limitations became apparent in combat over Germany's cities, it was too late to change course. The Americans were building heavy machine guns faster than Germany could build anything. November 7, 1943, ended badly for the Luftwaffe. Of the 376 bombers that attacked Schweinfurt that day, the Germans managed to shoot down 60. But the bombers kept coming, day after day, each one bristling with Brownings. And every month, American factories produced more bombers, more fighters, and more 50-caliber machine guns than Germany could destroy. Second Lieutenant Hans Wieck survived that mission. He would fly 68 more combat missions before war's end. He would see the Luftwaffe's strength steadily erode, not just from pilot losses, but from the simple arithmetic of attrition. Every American aircraft shot down was replaced. Every German aircraft lost was increasingly difficult to replace. And every engagement reinforced the brutal lesson of industrial warfare. Sometimes, the side with the simpler logistics and more productive factories wins not because their weapons are more sophisticated, but because they can put those weapons in the hands of more troops more often. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The question that military historians still debate isn't whether the MG-131 was a good weapon. It was. The question is whether Germany's entire approach to heavy machine guns was strategically sound given the nature of World War II. Did the German focus on lightweight, mobile, rifle-caliber machine guns make sense for a military that would increasingly fight defensive battles against enemies with overwhelming material superiority? Or should Germany have developed and fielded a true heavy machine gun doctrine, even if it meant heavier weapons and greater logistical burden? To answer that question, we need to look beyond the MG-131 itself and examine the broader context of German weapons development, industrial capacity, and strategic situation as the war progressed. Because the story of the MG-131 isn't really about one machine gun. It's about how nations make choices about weapon systems, and how those choices cascade through logistics, doctrine, and ultimately combat effectiveness. The answer begins with understanding what happened in German factories while American factories were churning out Brownings. Between 1941 and 1945, American industry produced approximately 3 million firearms chambered for the 50 BMG cartridge. This included the M2HB for ground use, the M2 for aircraft, and various naval versions. The production was distributed across multiple contractors: Colt, Frigidaire Division of General Motors, Buffalo Arms, and others. By spreading production across multiple facilities, the United States ensured that bombing one factory wouldn't cripple 50-caliber output. Germany's production of the MG-131 was far more modest. Exact production figures remain disputed among historians, but credible estimates place total MG-131 production at approximately 100,000 units between 1940 and 1945. This included both the aircraft-mounted version and a ground-mounted version that saw limited use. The disparity wasn't 3-to-1 or even 5-to-1. It was 30-to-1. For every MG-131 that rolled off German production lines, American factories produced 30 Browning 50s. This production gap reflected more than just industrial capacity. It reflected strategic choices made years before the war began. When American military planners standardized on the 50 BMG cartridge in the 1920s, they committed to building an entire ammunition production infrastructure around that single cartridge. The 50 BMG served in machine guns, sniper rifles, and eventually even anti-materiel rifles. This standardization simplified logistics. Every 50 caliber weapon in American service, whether on a tank in North Africa, a bomber over Germany, or a Navy destroyer in the Pacific, used the same ammunition. Germany took a different approach. German forces used the 13x64B cartridge for the MG-131, the 15mm MG-151 for heavily armed fighter variants, the 20mm MGFF and MG-151/20 cannons in multiple versions, the 30mm Mk108 and Mk103, and dozens of other calibers for rifles, machine guns, cannons, and artillery. Each caliber required its own ammunition production line, its own quality control standards, its own logistics chain from factory to front line. This proliferation of calibers gave German forces tactical flexibility. The FW-190A8 Sturmbach could carry 4 30mm cannons and 2 MG-131s, offering both long-range cannon punch and close-range machine gun fire. But tactical flexibility came at a strategic cost. Every additional caliber meant more complexity in ammunition production, more specialized tools and gauges, more inventory that couldn't be shared across different weapon types. When Allied bombing began targeting German industry in earnest in 1943, this complexity became a critical vulnerability. Consider the ball bearing problem. German aircraft engines, aircraft weapons, and precision machinery all depended on high-quality ball bearings. Most of Germany's ball bearing production was concentrated in Schweinfurt. When the 8th Air Force attacked Schweinfurt on August 17, 1943, and again on October 14, 1943, they inflicted significant damage on German ball bearing production. The attacks didn't stop German industry entirely, but they disrupted production schedules and forced dispersion of manufacturing to smaller, less efficient facilities. For a simple weapon like the M2 Browning, with its robust mechanical design and straightforward manufacturing, reduced bearing quality might slow production but wouldn't stop it. For complex weapons like the MG-131, with its electric priming system and tight tolerances, bearing shortages created cascading delays. By late 1943, German military production was facing a crisis not of design but of execution. Germany had excellent weapons on the drawing boards and in development. The problem was getting them into service in sufficient quantities. The Me-262 jet fighter was the most advanced aircraft in the world when it entered service in July 1944, but only 1,400 were built before war's end. The King Tiger tank, with its 88mm gun and massive armor, was nearly invulnerable from the front, but only 490 were produced. The MG-131 was a fine aircraft weapon, but there were never enough of them. Contrast this with American production. The B-17 Flying Fortress entered mass production in 1941. By war's end, 12,731 had been built. Each one carried 11 to 13 Browning 50s. That's roughly 150,000 aircraft-mounted 50-caliber machine guns installed in B-17s alone. The B-24 Liberator was produced in even greater numbers, 18,482 aircraft, each carrying 10 Brownings. Add the P-47 Thunderbolt with 8 50s per aircraft and 19,000 production, the P-51 Mustang with 6 50s and over 15,000 production, and you begin to understand the scale of American 50-caliber deployment. German pilots noticed this disparity in combat. Luftwaffe ace Johannes Steinhoff, who flew Me-262 jets against American bomber formations in 1945, described the experience of attacking a B-17 formation as flying into a steel sphere of fire. Every bomber had multiple gunners, each with a Browning 50. When a dozen bombers concentrated their fire on a single attacking fighter, the volume of tracers created an almost solid wall. Steinhoff noted that the psychological effect was as important as the physical danger. Pilots instinctively broke off attacks when they saw that much defensive fire, even if their aircraft hadn't been hit. The disparity extended to ammunition. A Browning 50 firing armor-piercing incendiary rounds at AB-17's typical combat altitude of 25,000 feet retained lethal velocity out to over 2 miles. German defensive positions around industrial cities like Schweinfurt and Regensburg reported falling 50-caliber projectiles after air battles. Spent rounds that had reached their apogee and fallen back to earth. These rounds, even after traveling several miles vertically and falling back down, still had enough kinetic energy to penetrate roofs and wound people on the ground. The 50 BMG's ballistic performance was simply superior to the 13mm cartridge fired by the MG-131. At 500 meters, a 50-caliber armor-piercing round retained substantially more kinetic energy than a 13mm round at the same distance. This translated to better penetration of aircraft armor, better chances of hitting critical components like engines or fuel tanks, and more reliable ignition of fuel vapors. Luftwaffe pilots attacking American bombers needed to close to within 300 meters or less for their MG-131s to be truly effective. At that range, they were well within the effective envelope of the bomber's defensive armament. German tactical manuals from 1944 reflected this reality. They instructed fighter pilots to use their cannons at longer range, 500 to 600 meters, and reserve machine gun fire for closer attacks. But cannon ammunition was expensive and scarce. 20 and 30 millimeter rounds required more propellant, more metal, and more manufacturing steps than 13 millimeter rounds. A typical Bf 109 G6 carried 60 rounds for its 30 millimeter Mk 108 cannon, 500 rounds total for its two Mg 131s, and nothing else. 3 firing passes with the cannon would exhaust its ammunition. After that, the pilot was left with only his machine guns. American fighters faced no such constraints. P-47 Thunderbolt carried 400 rounds per gun for its 8 Brownings, 3,200 rounds total. P-51 Mustang carried 400 rounds for its inboard guns and 270 for its outboard guns, 1,940 rounds total. Even after several engagements, American fighters often returned to base with ammunition remaining. This abundance changed pilot behavior. American pilots could afford to fire longer bursts, to engage targets at greater range, to use their guns for suppressive fire as well as for killing shots. German pilots had to count their ammunition, calculate angles, and make every burst matter. The logistical implications of this disparity rippled through the entire German war effort. By 1944, Germany was fighting on 3 fronts, eastern, western, and southern, plus defending its own airspace against strategic bombing. Every locomotive carrying 50 caliber equivalent ammunition to Luftwaffe bases in France was a locomotive not carrying rifle ammunition to infantry divisions in Russia. Every factory producing MG-131 components was a factory not producing MG-42 components for ground forces. Every skilled machinist assembling electric priming systems for aircraft guns was a skilled worker not assembling more critical weapons. German industrial planners understood this. They had limited resources and had to prioritize. The choice they made, rightly or wrongly, was to prioritize the weapons that seemed most immediately necessary. Infantry needed machine guns, so MG-42 production continued at high levels even as MG-131 production lagged. Tank destroyers needed anti-tank guns, so production of 88 mm Pak-43 guns took precedence over aircraft armament. The Luftwaffe, by mid-1944, was increasingly seen as a lost cause by German strategic planners. Better to invest resources in ground forces that might slow the Soviet advance from the east or the Allied advance from the west. This creates a counterfactual historians still debate. What if Germany had committed to heavy machine gun production at American scales? What if Rheinmetall Borsig had produced 300,000 MG-131s instead of 100,000? What if every FW-190 carried 4 MG-131s instead of 2? Would it have mattered? The consensus among military historians is probably not. By 1944, Germany's strategic position was beyond salvage through better small arms. The fundamental problems were fuel shortages, pilot attrition, industrial bombing, and the collapse of the Eastern Front. More machine guns couldn't solve those problems. But the counterfactual illustrates an important principle of industrial warfare. Success isn't just about having good weapons. It's about having enough good weapons, enough ammunition for those weapons, enough logistics to deliver the ammunition, and enough industrial capacity to sustain production even under attack. The United States had all of those elements. The Browning M2 was a good weapon, not perfect but very good. More importantly, America produced it in overwhelming quantities, fed it with millions of rounds of ammunition, and deployed it everywhere American forces fought. The consistency mattered as much as the quality. A B-17 crew knew exactly what defensive armament they would have. A tank commander knew exactly what weapon would be on his turret. An infantry platoon knew exactly what heavy weapon would be at company headquarters. Standardization created confidence. Germany never achieved that level of standardization with heavy machine guns. The MG-131 served primarily as an aircraft weapon. The 15mm MG-151 saw limited use in heavily armed fighters. Some FW-190A5s and A6s carried MG-151s, but production was tiny compared to the MG-131. German bomber crews, meanwhile, often relied on handheld 7.92mm MG-15 or MG-81 machine guns for defense, rifle-caliber weapons against American fighters with 6 or 8 50-caliber machine guns. The imbalance was stark and worsened as the war progressed. There was one area where German heavy machine gun development might have made a significant difference, and that was in anti-aircraft defense. The Flak 38 20mm anti-aircraft gun was effective against low-flying aircraft, but it was a cannon, not a machine gun. It fired at much lower rates than a machine gun and required more complex ammunition. Some German military planners advocated for developing a ground-mounted heavy machine gun specifically for anti-aircraft use, something comparable to the M2 Browning on an anti-aircraft mount. Such a weapon could have provided better defense of troop columns, supply convoys, and forward positions against Allied fighter bombers. But German anti-aircraft doctrine was built around dedicated flak units with specialized guns, not distributed heavy machine guns at company or battalion level. This made sense when the Luftwaffe controlled the skies and German troops didn't face constant air attack. By 1944, with Allied air superiority complete in the west and growing in the east, German ground forces were extraordinarily vulnerable to air attack. A distributed network of heavy machine guns for anti-aircraft defense might have forced Allied fighter bombers to higher altitudes or made ground attack more costly. But developing, producing, and fielding such weapons in 1944 would have required time and resources Germany no longer had. The last months of the war saw German weapons development take increasingly desperate turns. Engineers designed weapons that could be produced with minimal machining, using stamped metal and simple assembly. The Volkssturmgewehr 1-5, the People's Assault Rifle, was crudely made but functional, designed to be manufactured in furniture factories with minimal tooling. The Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon was a disposable tube that could be made by semi-skilled workers. These weapons reflected Germany's situation by late 1944, industrial capacity crumbling, resources scarce, time running out. In that context, further development of the MG-131 was pointless. Even if German engineers had designed an improved model with better rate of fire or reduced weight, there was no capacity to produce it in meaningful numbers. The factories were being bombed. The machine tools were wearing out. Skilled workers were being drafted into combat units. The aluminum and steel needed for gun barrels were going to more critical weapons. By early 1945, some Luftwaffe units were cannibalizing crashed aircraft for spare parts because new parts weren't arriving. Hans Wieck, the Bf-109 pilot who survived the November 7, 1943 mission over Bremen, flew his last combat mission on April 26, 1945. By then, he was flying from improvised airstrips in southern Germany, scrounging fuel, and knowing that every sortie might be his last. His 109 G6 still carried 2 MG-131s above the engine. They still worked, but ammunition was scarce and it hardly mattered. The American fighters he encountered, P-51 Mustangs with 6 Browning 50s and external fuel tanks giving them hours of combat time, outnumbered German fighters by 20 or 30 to 1. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. When the shooting stopped, the United States had over 200,000 Browning M2 machine guns in service across all branches. Germany had perhaps 20,000 MG-131s remaining, most of them in aircraft that would be scrapped or captured. The final accounting of the heavy machine gun question wasn't really about which weapon was better. It was about which nation had built an industrial system capable of producing and sustaining their chosen weapon at scale. After the war, the Browning M2 continued in service. The Korean War saw it used extensively for ground support and anti-aircraft defense. Vietnam saw it mounted on helicopters, riverboats, and vehicles. In the Gulf War, it remained the standard heavy machine gun of American forces. Today, more than 75 years after its development, variants of the M2 Browning remain in frontline service with American forces and dozens of other militaries worldwide. Over 3 million have been manufactured. It has served longer than any other military firearm in American history. The MG-131, by contrast, disappeared after 1945. A few examples survived in museums. Collectors occasionally find parts. But as a weapon system, it died with the Third Reich. There were no export models, no post-war production, no licensed manufacturing in other countries. It was a weapon designed for a specific military, optimized for specific roles, and when that military ceased to exist, so did the need for the weapon. This tells us something important about weapons development. The most successful military firearms aren't necessarily the most technically sophisticated. They're the ones that balance performance with reliability, manufacturability, and logistics. The M2 Browning was never the most advanced heavy machine gun. The German MG-131 had a higher rate of fire. The Soviet DSHK had comparable hitting power. But the M2 was good enough in performance, simple enough to manufacture, reliable enough to serve in any environment from Arctic cold to desert heat, and produced in quantities that allowed it to be everywhere American forces fought. The MG-131 was an excellent aircraft weapon. German pilots who flew with it praised its reliability and firepower. But it was part of a weapons development philosophy that prioritized technical excellence over industrial scalability. Germany produced some of the most advanced weapons of World War II: jet fighters, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, guided bombs, wire-guided anti-tank missiles. But these technical achievements couldn't compensate for the fundamental arithmetic of industrial warfare. No matter how sophisticated your weapons, if your enemy can produce 10 times as many weapons that are 80% as good, you will eventually be overwhelmed. That was the real lesson of the MG-131 versus the Browning M2. Not that Germany copied America's design, they didn't. Not that Germany missed the belt feed system, they used belt feeds too. The lesson was about strategic choices. Germany chose technical sophistication and diverse calibers. America chose standardization and mass production. Both choices had logical foundations. But in total war, the side that can field more weapons, more ammunition, and more platforms to carry those weapons has an enormous advantage that superior engineering can rarely overcome. By late 1944, German pilots understood this. They looked at the formations of American bombers, each bristling with Brownings, escorted by fighters with more Brownings, and they knew the arithmetic was against them. They flew anyway because they were ordered to, because they hoped for a miracle, because surrender was unthinkable. But in the quiet moments between missions, they knew. The Americans hadn't won because they were better pilots or had better tactics. They had won because they had more of everything. More aircraft, more fuel, more ammunition, and more heavy machine guns than Germany could ever match. Hans Wieck survived the war. He flew 69 combat missions, was shot down once, and bailed out twice. After the war, he rarely spoke about his experiences. When historians interviewed him decades later, he described the MG-131 as a good weapon that never had enough ammunition. That simple statement captured the entire story. Germany had built a technically excellent heavy machine gun, but they had never built the industrial infrastructure to feed it, support it, and deploy it at scales that matched their enemies. The Browning M2, meanwhile, continued firing. In Korea, American forces found that the .50 caliber machine gun remained effective against North Korean and Chinese forces. In Vietnam, door gunners on Huey helicopters used it to suppress ground fire. In Iraq and Afghanistan, it served on vehicle mounts, providing firepower against insurgents and light vehicles. As of 2025, the M2 Browning remains in production. FN Herstal manufactures current variants. The basic design that John Moses Browning finalized in the 1920s is still good enough for 21st century combat. No other weapon in American service can make that claim. The M1 Garand was replaced by the M14, then the M16, then the M4. The M1911 pistol gave way to the M9, then the M17. Artillery, tanks, aircraft, everything has been replaced multiple times. But the M2 endures because it hit a sweet spot in design that remains relevant. It's powerful enough to engage light vehicles and aircraft, reliable enough to work in any environment, simple enough to maintain in field conditions, and proven enough that soldiers trust it. That trust matters. When soldiers know a weapon will work, they use it confidently. When they doubt a weapon, they hesitate. The M2 has earned trust through decades of reliable performance. Soldiers who use it know it will fire, know the ammunition will feed, know the weapon will survive harsh conditions. That confidence, built through generations of combat experience, is as much a weapon as the machine gun itself. The MG-131 never had the chance to build that legacy. It served for 5 years in one military in one war. When that war ended, the weapon passed into history. It deserves recognition as a sophisticated piece of engineering, as evidence of German technical skill, and as a weapon that served its intended role well. But it was never going to be a Browning M2. It was never going to serve for 80 years. It was never going to be produced in millions. It was a weapon of its time, built for specific purposes, and when those purposes ended, so did the weapon. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.